Are there any other amendments? If not, we will proceed to a roll call vote on the pending amendments, after which, without objection, after completion of the roll call votes on the pending amendments, the previous question will be automatically ordered, and we'll then go to final passage. So I want to advise all members who are sitting, watching this whole proceeding on their television sets in their offices, to because what else would they be doing? To take note that we're about to proceed to a roll call vote. Will the clerk tell us how many amendments we're going to have a roll call vote on?
Mr. Chairman, there were 5 amendments that were postponed for roll call,
Okay.
including the en bloc one.
Okay. The first one, in order, clerk will tell us which one is first in order.
Mr. Chairman, that was the amendment offered by Mr. Rogers, 001.
Mr. Chairman.
Limitation of application.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Martin.
Strike the requisite number of words.
Gentleman's recognized.
I'd like to point out we've never done this before.
Yes.
And we have lots of people who are not here.
Yeah.
So I would recommend that the chairman have a quorum call to get members here and then do the roll call votes.
Why don't we do the roll call vote, and we're not going to declare the vote over unless the quorum has responded.
Okay. Because, I mean, it's not,
save the time.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes,
it's
Mr.
not
Boyer.
fair to have roll call votes when less than half the,
Well, do you want a quorum call?
I'm just suggesting.
I'm just trying to figure out the quickest way to do it, but if you want a quorum call, we can do that, or we can call the roll, and then members will come and...
You're the
we'll
chairman.
wait.
I just,
Mr. Boyd, do
There
you have a
is-
suggestion?
Before you ask for the vote, if I may, Mr.
Yes.
Chairman, I ask that a letter to you from the Association of National Advertisers, the American Association of Advertising Agencies, and the American Advertising Federation be included in the record. This letter highlights the concerns the 3 agencies have on the constitutionality of some of the provisions in the bill. I shared this with you, and I would ask unanimous consent that this letter dated March 3rd, 2009 be entered into the record.
Without objection, is it one letter?
It
Or
is
several
one.
letters?
No, it's one letter, but it's
Without objection, the letter referred to by Mr. Boyer will be made part of the record. Let's proceed on a roll call vote, and the roll will not be closed until at least a quorum, and we'll give everybody a full opportunity to respond. So the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman? No. Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingle?
what are we voting on? Which amendment?
The clerk will tell us again the vote.
Mr. Chairman,
This is Mr. Rogers, one of Mr. Rogers' amendment, not the
Mr.
unblocked
Rogers,
one.
Right. It's the Rogers Amendment number 001 regarding limitation on application of act. Is that right?
Please proceed with the vote. Roll. Vote. Yeah.
Mr. Dingle? Mr. Markey? Mr. Boucher? Mr. Pallone? No. Mr. Pallone, no. Mr. Gordon? Mr. Rush? Ms. Eshue? Mr. Stupak? Mr. Engel? Mr. Green? Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes no. Mrs. Capps? Mr. Doyle?
We have 5 amendments?
Ms. Harmon? Ms. Harmon votes no. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee votes no. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin votes no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Weiner? Mr. Weiner votes no. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Melanson? Mr. Melanson votes no. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen? Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut? Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, no. Mr. Space? No. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton? Ms. Sutton votes no. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Barton? Aye. Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton? Mr. Stearns? Mr. Deal? Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Blunt? Mr. Boyer? Mr. Boyer votes aye. Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bono-Mack? Ms. Bono-Mack, aye. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick? Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania? Mr. Burgess? Ms. Blackburn? Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Skellies? Mr. Skellies, aye.
Why don't you call the roll of those members who did not respond?
All right.
Or do you want to just recognize them?
I know. Mr. Boucher?
Okay.
Votes no.
Mr. Boucher, no. Mr. Green? No. Mr. Green votes no. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Butterfield? No. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Engel? No. Mr. Engel votes no. Mr. Gordon? No. Mr. Gordon, no. Mr. Stupak? No. Mr. Stupak votes no. Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Radonovich votes aye. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson votes no.
Mr. Ross?
Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes no.
Have all members responded to the vote? Any member wish to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will tally the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the ayes were 13 and the nays were 28.
13 ayes, 28 noes. The amendment's not agreed to. We now proceed to the second of what will be 6 roll call votes. Clerk will report the amendment that we're voting on, and then we'll proceed to the vote.
Mr. Chairman, this was an amendment to H.R. 1256 offered by Mr. Burgess in Section 907D3 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, as added by Section 101B3 of the
We all
bill.
know that.
Strike subparagraph B.
Okay. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman?
No.
Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Dingle votes no. Mr. Markey? Mr. Boucher? Mr. Boucher, no. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Mr. Pallone, no. Mr. Gordon? Mr. Gordon votes no. Mr. Rush? Ms. Eshoo? Mr. Stupak? Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Green? Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes no. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps votes no. Mr. Doyle? Ms. Harmon? Ms. Harmon votes no. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Inslee? Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin votes no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Weiner? Mr. Weiner votes no. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson? Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen? Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut? Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, no. Mr. Space? Mr. Space votes no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton? Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton? Mr. Stearns? Mr. Deal? Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shadegg? Mr. Blunt? Mr. Boyer? Mr. Boyer votes no. Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bono Mack? Pass. Ms. Bono Mack passes. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry votes aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mrs. Myrick? Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania? Votes aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania votes aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess votes aye. Ms. Blackburn? Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Radonovich votes aye. Ms. Bonomack? Ms. Bonomack is off, present, pass, and on aye. Mr. Rush? Not recorded, Mr. Chairman. He's over. Mr. Rush votes no. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee votes no.
Have all members responded to the vote? Clerk will tally the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the vote was 14 ayes and 31 noes.
14 ayes, 31 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. Clerk will report the next amendment.
This is a vote on the amendment offered by Mr. Boyer, number 011.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman?
No.
Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Dingle? No, wrong one. Yeah, I know. Mr. Markey? Mr. Boucher? Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Gordon? Mr. Gordon, no. Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush, no. Ms. Eshoo? Mr. Stupak? Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Green? Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette, no. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle? Ms. Harmon? Ms. Harmon, no. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee votes no. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin votes no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Weiner? Mr. Weiner votes no. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield votes no. Mr. Melanson? Mr. Melanson votes no. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill votes no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes no. Mrs. Christensen? Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut? Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, no. Mr. Space? Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton? Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton? Mr. Stearns? Mr. Deal? Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Blunt? Mr. Boyer? Mr. Boyer votes aye. Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Radonovich votes aye. Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bono Mack? Ms. Bono Mack, aye. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Terry? Aye. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick? Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, aye. You're hiding. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania votes aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania votes aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn? Ms. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scully? Mr. Scully votes aye. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes no.
All members responded to the roll? Call of the roll? Yes. Mr. Gonzalez, how do you vote?
Mr. Gonzalez votes no.
Any other members wish to be recognized? If not, the clerk will tally the roll. Hold it. Hold it.
Mr. Dingle, no. On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the yeas were 17 and the nays were 33.
17 ayes, 33 noes. The amendment's not agreed to. Clerk will report the next amendment to be voted on.
This is an amendment by Mr. Rogers, number 002.
Unblock.
Yes, sir, that is the en bloc amendment.
Okay. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman.
No.
Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Markey. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon votes no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Stupak. I'm sorry, I skipped one. Hang on one second. Ms. Eshoo. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, no. Ms. DeGette. Mrs. DeGette votes no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton votes no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Brewer. Mr. Brewer, aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich, aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono Mack. Ms. Bono Mack, aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Anybody miss? Okay. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, no.
All members having responded to the vote, clerk will announce the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the yeas were 18 and the nays were 33.
18 ayes, 33 noes, the amendment's not agreed to. Have we completed the, all the amendments?
No.
One more.
One moment, Mr. Chairman. I have one more. The Rogers Amendment 008 was, a roll call was requested on that.
It
That was
prohibits the use
fees
of
being
funds.
collected? Yeah.
It prohibits the use of funds. Clerk will call the roll.
Okay.
This is the last amendment, then we'll proceed to final passage.
My little- Mr. Waxman.
No?
Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher, no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon, no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, no. Ms. Eshue. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, no. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon, no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booyer. Mr. Booyer, aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich, aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono Mack. Ms. Bono Mack, aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye.
Have all members responded to the roll? Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania votes aye. Okay. Ready.
Clerk, ready to report the vote?
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the yeas were 19 and the nays were 33.
19 ayes, 33 noes. The amendment's not agreed to. The vote now comes on reporting the bill from the committee with the usual instructions, and the clerk will call the roll for final passage.
Mr. Waxman?
Aye.
Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Markey? Mr. Boucher? Mr. Boucher, aye. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone, aye. Mr. Gordon? Mr. Gordon, aye. Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Eshoo? Mr. Stupak? Mr. Stupak, aye. Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel, aye. Mr. Green? Mr. Green, aye. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle? Ms. Harmon? Ms. Harmon, aye. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee, aye. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin votes aye. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross? I know. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Wiener? Mr. Wiener, aye. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Melanson? Mr. Melanson, aye. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow, aye. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill, aye. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mrs. Christensen? Mrs. Christensen, aye. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes, aye. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut? Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, aye. Mr. Space? Mr. Space, aye. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, aye. Ms. Sutton? Ms. Sutton, aye. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley votes aye. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch, aye. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton, no. Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton? Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns, no. Mr. Deal? Mr. Deal, no. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield, no. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Blunt? Mr. Boyer? Mr. Boyer, no. Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Radonovich, no. Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts, no. Ms. Bono Mack? Ms. Bono Mack, aye. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, no. Mrs. Myrick? Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania? Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, no. Mrs. Blackburn? Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey, no. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, no.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? We have one more coming, so don't, we're not closing it yet. Mr. Dingle?
Mr. Dingle, aye.
Okay, and there's There's one more, we understand, coming on the Republican side.
I'm told Mr. Shattuck is on this one.
Clerk can do a preliminary count, and then when we find out how this next member votes, then we'll have the final tally.
At this time, the vote is,
Well,
oh, you want me? Okay.
just so you're ready.
Is he not there? He's not out there, so you can...
Okay, clerk will announce the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the ayes were 39 and the nays were 13.
39 ayes, 13 noes. The bill is reported out of the committee with the usual instructions. That concludes our business. We stand adjourned.